How will the Panthers rebuild their safety room this offseason? We'll talk about it right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Fridays throughout the entirety of the offseason, I'm right here answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council to get your questions in for this week's edition of the weekly Friday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. Today's episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. And we're continuing to look at the Carolina Panthers defense today. Last week, looked at the defensive line, the edge rushers, the cornerback room, the linebacker room. And now we're going to look at the safety group, which needs to possibly and very likely be rebuilt this offseason. As you look at it, Xavier Woods, Jordan Fuller, Nick Scott, Sam Franklin Jr., Lonnie Johnson, 5 of the safeties from the room this past year are all unrestricted free agents upcoming here once the new league year begins on March 12th. So the Panthers may have to replace all of them. There's probably one of them, maybe a couple of them that have an argument to come back, depending on the role that Carolina wants them to play in. We'll get to all of that on today's show. But first, let's look back at the 2024 season for the Carolina Panthers safeties. And if you go all the way back to August, there was a lot of excitement about this room, considering Xavier Woods is coming back. And in 2023, he low-key was a top 10, top 12 safety in the NFL. So he was coming back for the third and final year of his contract. They were bringing in Jordan Fuller, who played well in Los Angeles and had been in this scheme before with the Jerry Rivera, who was his position coach way back when they were with the Rams. Nick Scott was coming off of a tough year in Cincinnati where he was playing in a different scheme. He started, then was benched in the final couple of games of the season, was the lowest graded safety according to PFF back in 2023, but back in a scheme that he was comfortable in, possibly with that experience, he would play well. Demani Richardson, the undrafted free agent at Texas A&M, had a wonderful day on that Monday. I was there at training camp where he picked off Bryce Young, picked off Jack Plummer. It's like, okay, maybe this young guy's got something to do. You got Jamie Robinson in there. There was just a lot of depth there at safety. It felt like the deepest position group that Carolina had on its roster. And then once you get to the season, you have the injuries and you have the play that overall was fairly disappointing for the most part, considering what the expectations were all the way back prior to the season beginning in August for this safety group. And let's start off with Xavier Woods, who has been the longest tenured of those safeties, sans, of course, Sam Franklin Jr., who's really just been a special teamer. But Xavier Woods, last 3 years, played as a starter. He played and started in all 17 games back in 2024, led the team with 119 tackles and also led the team with 3 interceptions, ended up with a 57.0 PFF grade, which is the worst of his career in Carolina. Wasn't the greatest in coverage this past season. When you look at the rest of the group, he was among the most reliable, if not the most reliable, considering he played in all those games, led the team in tackling, and Carolina really struggled when it came to tackles. His missed tackle percentage was an 8.7. I actually know 7.8 rather, one of the lowest among all the Panthers on the team last year, especially with the secondary that had a tough time be able to tackle when they got the runners got into the second level, or just anybody got into the second level last year offensively against Carolina. So Xavier Woods, fine season, enough probably to warrant conversations whether he should come back. We'll get into more of that later on here on the show. Jordan Fuller, he was somebody that I think a lot of people we're excited to see what he could do, as maybe he was a better fit than Von Bell was in this scheme a year ago in Carolina. And Von Bell went back to Cincinnati. Of course, Nick Scott, who kind of replaced Von Bell, he came to Carolina. Those two guys moving back to systems that made more sense for them. But Jordan Fuller, he started with the Rams. He helped them get to the playoffs the year prior and was a solid piece in that secondary. So there certainly, for me, I thought, okay, here we go. this should be maybe not an upgrade, but certainly someone who's better fitting in what Xavier wants to do. He does not have to have that learning curve where Von Bell had it last offseason. That was not the case for Jordan Fuller. Having to have that learning curve, can come in, plug and play starter, and hopefully it works out. And unfortunately, didn't really work out. Missed 6 games. He got injured in that against the Raiders game, week 3, hamstring injury. And I mean, everybody had a hamstring injury, it felt like, in Carolina this past season. He missed 6 games. Then when he came back, really wasn't the same guy. He ended up being a healthy scratch too the final 3 weeks in favor of Demani Richardson, the undrafted free agent out of Texas A&M, who took over his role and was out there starting in 2 of those final 3 weeks over Jordan Fuller. So that wasn't great to see, as that is kind of become commonplace. So there's guys who you thought were going to be starters, and then they become healthy scratches. And that's what happened with Jordan Fuller. It also happened with Dane Jackson as well, as he lost his job to Shaw Smith-Wade, the rookie out of Washington State, playing in that nickel slot corner. And then he got hurt. Of course, Shaw Smith-Wade did. And then you brought Dane Jackson back in. So 2 guys you were depending on get injured, miss a ton of time, hamstring injuries, and when they come back, they're not the same guys that they look like in training camp. And that's kind of to be expected when you have that kind of injury, miss that amount of time. But then to be a healthy scratch, close out the season, tough to see. He had a 53.8 PFF grade. That was 82nd among safeties in the NFL this past year. And really the coverage grade, 47.0. Our first impression of Jordan Fuller was week 1 against New Orleans on that opening drive where the Saints hit that deep ball to Rashid Shaheed, and there was miscommunication between him and JC Horn. Wasn't on JC. Jordan supposed to stay over the top, did not do that. That led to a big touchdown there, as the Saints just ran all over the Panthers on that Sunday afternoon down in New Orleans on week 1. So Jordan Fuller, probably a one and done here in Carolina, I would assume. Nick Scott was considered the 3rd of the 3 starters by DC Xavier during training camp back in August. This would be him, Woods, and Fuller as starting guys here in Carolina. And you saw that when watching, that they would rotate in and out. If they wanted to go 3 safeties, it would be those 3. And Nick Scott also dealt with injuries, missed 7 games, did injury. 6 of them, truly, he was on IR. 1 of them just inactive as he was still trying to get his way back. And then he did make 4 starts this past year, had a 52.6 PFF grade. So better than what he put up last year in Cincinnati, but still not good enough to really make an impact in Carolina. And speaking of guys who really struggled tackling, I go back to, I believe it was the Cincinnati game right before halftime, where Carolina was trying to get up the field, not give up a touchdown, and the Bengals, they gambled. It was either they're going to score a touchdown or they were going to have the clock run out on them, and Nick Scott just could not make the tackle on Jamar Chase. And kind of not that surprising. Jamar Chase, the best receiver in the NFL, arguably the best receiver in the NFL, argue amongst yourselves. But he was able to make a miss, score a touchdown. Nick Scott had a 16.7% missed tackle rate this past year. So juxtapose that with Xavier Woods, 7.8, 16.7 for Nick Scott, among the worst on the Carolina Panthers roster this past year. Really was not great for them. Did play special teams, 60% of special team snaps, so maybe there's a role for him there later on if he comes back to Carolina. But overall, that is not enough what you got from him this past year. Now, the guy who you have to feel good about moving forward is Demani Richardson, who, again, during training camp, made some plays during practice, looked good in the preseason games as well. And you wondered, would he make the roster? And, well, he did make the roster. And then how much would he play? And he ended up playing a lot. Played in 14 games, starting 5 as a rookie again. Took over Jordan Fuller's starting spot there later on in the season, had 51 tackles, 2 pass breakups, had an interception as well, had a 60.1 PFF grade. That was the highest among the Panther safeties this past season, and 66th in the NFL, according to all the players that were eligible, that played enough snaps. That was 7th among 11 qualifying rookie safeties. So not the best of the rookie safeties, but considering wasn't drafted, had to earn that job, got that spot out of training camp, and then later on took over the starting role. That is an encouraging start to his Panthers career, and you would right now pencil him in to be one of the starters at safety for Carolina next season. But what are you going to do with the rest of the safety group, considering that Nick Scott is a unrestricted free agent, Jordan Fuller is, Xavier Woods, and then also looking at your 2 special teamers, Sam Franklin Jr. and Lonnie Johnson. So how will the Carolina Panthers attack safety position in free agency and in the draft this offseason? We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked on Panthers. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you missed the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth-quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Back here on Locked On Panthers, taking a look at the Carolina Panthers safety room, as it looks like they're going to have to likely rebuild it this offseason. I would pencil in right now Demani Richardson, the upcoming second-year player out of A&M, to be one of the starting safeties. And then maybe Xavier Woods comes back, but the rest of the guys that we talked about earlier in that first segment probably wouldn't want to bring them back in a starting role. Certainly, if they want to play special teams, that's fine. But Carolina likely looking for at least one new starting safety and maybe two starting safeties if they want to kind of have that trio again like they did last year. And I would think that's probably likely what they would want to do. So probably two, maybe just one if they want to do more two safety look this upcoming season in 2025. Javon, a critical season for him and the Panthers defense as he's entering in the final year of his deal. And also the Panthers have to bounce back from being one of the worst defenses in the history of the NFL last season in 2024. But looking at free agent options, I think it's important to look at the ages of some of the guys that Carolina may be targeting. I think they're going to do exactly what they did last offseason and try to target guys entering into their second contract and not try to find a 30 or 31, 32-year-old plug-and-play kind of player who can be a stopgap for the future. When you already have someone like Demani Richardson, that's fine. Now, Jamie Robinson would have been nice had he panned out and been a part of this team moving forward, but he was let go in the middle of last season, and that's another one of those failed draft picks by Scott Fitterer, who did not work out, a day 3 pick a couple years ago out of Florida State. So he's gone. It would have been nice to have him and Richardson potentially at safety this year, but that's not going to be the pairing, as Richardson should be back, and then we'll see what the Panthers decide to do. So let's look at guys who are going to be in their second contracts coming up here in free agency. First, looking at Trevon Moehig, who was with the Raiders last season, or I guess in his career so far. He had a 67.5 PFF grade. That was 36th among safeties in the NFL this past year. Looking over at Spot Track to place for contracts and his market value, they have him marketed at 3 years, $47 million, and that's $15.7 million per year. So I think that's kind of the ballpark where Carolina will be as far as what they're paying safeties. Now, $15 million a year is a decent amount of money. And do you want to spend that much money? I mean, he's going to be 26, so could make sense for them to do that. That's kind of what you're looking at if they want to get these younger safeties that have experience that are entering into that first real deal that they get in the NFL. So he's an option for Carolina. Got Javon Holland, who's been down to Miami. He had a 63.0 PFF grade. That's 56th among safeties. So kind of right around what you had last year as far as production. And he has a market value that is 4 years, $60 million, and that's $15 million per year. So right below Moehig as far as average annual salary. That's another player that would make a lot of sense for Carolina. Got Julian Blackmon, who actually would be, it's his third contract. He played his 4 years in Indianapolis and signed a 1-year deal last year, more of a prove-it deal. And then now he's a free agent once again, but this would be him really signing that first big deal. And he had a 69.3 PFF grade, the highest among the guys that we're talking about here. And that was 30th among safeties in the NFL. 3 years, $24 million, and that's $8 million per year. That is his market value. And for Carolina, like that may make the most sense if they're not trying to spend too much, knowing that probably going to spend a decent amount of money on defensive tackle, corner. They're going to have to spend money there if they bring back Mike Jackson. If they don't bring back Mike Jackson, they might try to spend money on a receiver, and they only have so much right now. There's ways to open it up, and I've started to see some teams across the league that have decided to start cutting some guys, and we'll talk about some of these players that have been recently been cut who may make sense in Carolina. I saw Raheem Mostert down there, Miami, possibly. That could make sense. Maybe him and Javon Holland have a reunion here in Carolina. Holland, of course, playing safety, Mostert backing up Chuba Hubbard. So we'll talk about some of that probably later on this week, some of the players that end up being cap casualties or can get cut by their teams who could make sense for Carolina coming up. But yeah, so Julian Blackmon, that might be somebody. But really, I think Moehig, Holland, Blackman, as far as guys in their second contracts, those are the dudes. I also looked at Andre Cisco, who's been down in Jacksonville, as someone who could potentially make sense in his market value. I think it was only like a 1 year, $8 million deal or something like that. And he might have to sign a prove it deal as he was coming off of a terrible defense in its own right in Jacksonville down there as well. Look at a lot of the advanced metrics. It was either the Panthers or the Jags who were dead last in the NFL and just overall defense, looking at DVOA and EPA as well. So those are 4 guys that could make sense. Now, obviously, Carolina could look at the draft, and I've wondered, would it be time to draft a safety again? And things not work out with Jamie Robinson. Now, as a 5th rounder, you're probably not expecting him, as we saw, to come in and start right away, which was not the case, as they had Von Bell already, and they, of course, already had Xavier Woods back in 2023. And then last year, you're hoping to take a step forward. That did not happen, and that led to him no longer being on the roster. It may be time now to draft a safety early on in the draft for the first time since 2020, when they took Jeremy Chin back there in the 2nd round. And Jeremy Chin, by the way, is a unrestricted free agent again this offseason. I don't think that he will be coming back to Carolina to play in this scheme. Crazier things have happened. We'll see. But don't think that's going to necessarily be what he and his camp want to do, and probably what the Panthers want to do upcoming here in free agency. So looking at the draft, some guys that could make sense. Xavier Watt's probably going to be drafted too high in the 1st round for Carolina. I don't think at 8. Safety is the most pressing need. Now, didn't think last year in the 2nd round that running back was most pressing need, or the 3rd round that linebacker was most pressing need. And looking back at it now, running back still was not the most pressing need, and certain linebacker it worked out to be, considering the injuries that Shaq Thompson suffered. And then you look also at Josie Jules, that worked out in Carolina's favor with Trevon Wallace out there playing a lot back in 2024. But some draft options that could be there, maybe in a 2nd round of 57, maybe early in 3rd round, and possibly Malaki Starks out of Georgia. He could be a 1st rounder. Same thing with Nick Imawari out of South Carolina. Just looking at PFF's big board, they don't have those guys that high up there. Andrew Makuba, who was at Clemson, but then played last year at Texas. They have him at 97. Lathan Ransom from Ohio State, 77th on the big board. Kevin Winston Jr. out of Penn State, he's 71 up there. Sebastian Castro out of Iowa, an older prospect at 24. He's 67th. So those are some guys that could make sense for Carolina if they want to do that. They want to wait until the 4th round, maybe early on. Got a Jonas Senker, excuse me, out of Virginia. Maybe somebody that could make sense for them at those points in times in the draft. You know, even if they want to wait later, if they want to wait later on. RJ Mickens out of Clemson, possibly. Malachi Moore also at Alabama, one of their starters from a year ago, an experienced player. He would be probably a day 3 pick as well. That's out there. So I would think for the most part, like if they're going to get somebody, make it happen in day 2. And don't wait till day 3, especially if you're asking this person to come in and be a starter right away. But we did see last year with Demani Richardson that he earned a job. He was undrafted. And so it could work out where they get somebody in the 5th to 6th round, and that happens again. But that's typically not how things work out in the NFL. So we'll see what they decide to do. What should they do? We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked on Panthers. So how will the Panthers approach the safety position this offseason? Looking at their 5 free agents: Xavier Woods, Jordan Fuller, Nick Scott, Sam Franklin Jr., and Lonnie Johnson. We'll start actually at the bottom of that list. Lonnie Johnson and Sam Franklin, they played 81% and 84% of the special team snaps, respectively. So it could make sense to bring one of them back, if not both of them back, in the special teams role. Now, Sam Franklin Jr. was a captain, special teams-wise, Carolina, so I would think he would make the most sense as far as those guys. He's been around for a while in Carolina. I know it's a newer staff, obviously, so maybe they look at Lonnie Johnson more favorably. I would think that Sam Franklin, just pure special teams wise, that would be a priority among those two. Now, Nick Scott, he's someone, if he comes back, and we talked to Mike K last month about this when looking at the Panthers free agency and really his offseason ahead and what they would do. And he talked about Nick Scott would make sense if he comes back in a special teams role, not somebody who's going to come back in any sort of like starting trio role at safety. Now, the good thing is he understands the scheme, probably is better in that spot than maybe Sam Franklin Jr., but it's kind of negligible at this point in time, considering that both of those guys really aren't starting caliber safeties and dudes that you want back there when playing. Now, certainly better than Colin Jones was in Carolina when he was here back in the day. But yeah, Sam Franklin Jr., I would think bringing him back would make sense. If they want to bring back Lonnie Johnson, like you got to fill out a 90-man roster for training camp anyway. So they want to sign all three of these guys to mainly special teams deals and have them duke it out. That works for me. Now, as far as Woods and Fuller, I think that's a one and done situation. Wasn't healthy when he was out there, lost his job, just didn't see a lot this past year to make me think that he deserves another year. And it was only a 1-year deal anyways. And when you get that 1-year deal, it's kind of like, all right, prove yourself. And unfortunately, didn't prove himself enough in Carolina. Maybe Dan Morgan talks to Jera and they feel like, okay, the market's a little bit too much for us. We'll circle back. And that's a guy I think down the road, you could wait till the second, third week of free agency there in March and then decide to go back to him if you didn't like the market, if you miss out on some guys early on that you were targeting, and then that's a backup plan. So that's always out there for them. I do think Xavier Woods probably has a market, maybe in the second round of free agency. Looking over at Spot Track to place for contracts, his market value is 1 year, $4.4 million. Not crazy at all if Carolina wants to pay that. I think that actually could make a lot of sense considering that he has been a good player for you last year. Didn't go great. I always go back to the Raiders game and how Carolina finally played well offensively and also played well defensively. And he's like yelling at the media and talking about like, oh, you guys talk bad about our defense. And then he went out there and was a part of the worst defense in franchise history and the worst scoring defense in history of the NFL. So I just chuckle at all that. And then like the personal foul, unnecessary roughness penalties, they get a little ridiculous. And like he has a reputation, whether it should have been or not, like the refs are going to call that because that's just the kind of guy that they see him to be. And I'm not trying to talk bad about his character or him as a football player, but he gets called for a lot of those. So that's one thing that you hate, but a lot of them, they kind of are kind of borderline sketch. Like I don't really know if that should have been a penalty or not. But I do think there's value in bringing back Xavier Woods back into the scheme for a third season, back in this locker room for a fourth season as a starter. So I would not hate to see that. I think just really what they should do is they want to do 3 starters again, at least have that 3-starter mindset, 3 guys you're going to rotate in those 2 starting spots. You have Demani Richardson already coming back for a second year. And then I think you sign Woods to that kind of deal in knowing that, okay, it's a 1-year deal, probably the final year you're going to have Woods here. You got Richardson on a really cheap deal right now as an undrafted free agent rookie. You can then probably spend the kind of money if you want to on Trevon Moehig or on Javon Holland or even on a lesser extent on Julian Blackman and on Andre Cisco if they want to go that route of finding another player entering into his second contract again like they did last season, really leaning in on some of those guys. Like that would make sense. So I would think you got Richardson, maybe sign back Woods, of course, sign back either the whole trio or a couple of the guys in terms of Sam Franklin Jr., Lonnie Johnson, who I think is also a junior, and then Nick Scott as guys who are coming in just to be special teamers. And then you go out there and you maybe bring back Xavier Woods. So I think Woods, sign a free agent, and then have Richardson back. That be your trio of starters, and then go out there and just bring back some of the guys, special teams wise, go find some other special teamers. That might make sense. And maybe even look in the draft if that's what they decide to do, if they decide what they kind of miss out with during free agency. So that's where I'm at right now. We'll look at the Carolina Panthers safety room here coming up once the new league year begins next month in March. But that's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe, follow the show free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Fridays throughout the offseason, I answer your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me to get those questions into me right now. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding. And we'll be back tomorrow talking about the special teams room. Panthers have signed another kicker, and JJ Jansen is officially back for another year. We'll talk about that here on Tuesday on Locked On Panthers.